The theme for this month's series of adult education programs is Jewish literacy. And by literacy, I don't just mean knowing how to read, because I'm actually not going to teach you how to read Hebrew or Yiddish or any other Jewish language, because it's not why you're here. It's to understand the words. After all, literary has the sense of words behind it too. So this will be a chance for us to build our Jewish vocabulary. I've created lists of 50 Jewish words. As you'll see, with some limitations, there are lists of Jewish places, Jewish ideas. We'll talk about all those as we go through the month sessions, but it will give us a chance to either fill in gaps, things we didn't know, maybe answer questions, or we've heard that word, but we weren't sure exactly what it meant, or perhaps to deepen knowledge for something we already knew, but can get to understand a little bit more in depth. So I'm going to jump right into sharing the document that has the list of the words. If anybody wants a copy of it afterwards, I'm happy to email it to you. You can just email me at rabbi@kolhadash.com, and I'll send the full list over to you, so you'll see it then. But in the meantime, let me get the sheet up and running. Oh, I need to go to share. There we go. All right. So here we are with a list of 50 Jewish words. But you'll notice in the small print, I left out some things. In this list of 50 Jewish words, there are no people. So Theodor Herzl, Abraham, they're not there because I had to limit it. To get to 50, you got to cut out something. I also didn't include any places. We actually have a separate list that are places. I didn't include any concepts like monotheism or, I do have diaspora there, but the chevra, the idea of a Jewish self-sufficient community. So certain concepts I decided to leave out. The holidays, as I said, we have a separate list just for those. Organizations, there are a gazillion Jewish organizations out there in the world. In fact, I have a friend who works in the organized Jewish community. Every year he puts together like a NCAA basketball tournament bracket with 64 different Jewish organizations battling against each other to see who's going to be the strongest organization for the year. And he does funny matchups like he had J Street, which is a left-wing pro-Israel organization, matched up against AIPAC, which is a right-wing pro-Israel organization, the National Council of Jewish Women against the National Council of Jewish Men, those kind of but there's all these organizations out there, the AJC, American Jewish Committee, versus the AJC, American Jewish Congress. We're not getting into the alphabet soup. We're not getting into all the different Jewish organizations that are out there. And this particular list is not focused on any particular historical events, like the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 of the Common Era, or the Holocaust in Europe in the middle of the 20th century. It's not focused as much on history, although there's certainly history will inform a number of these topics as we go through. So I thought what we'd do to start with that sort of overview in place is take a look at each column. They're broken up into 5 columns of 10. So if you look at the column all the way on your left that starts with Torah, take a look at those 10 words and do a count. How many do you know well? How many do you sort of know? And how many have you never heard before? So take a quick look through that column list on the left. How many do you know for sure? How many do you sort of know? And how many have you never heard of before? Does anybody have all 10? They can sign out of the Zoom and they're done? Well, my guess is you know many of these, but not all of these. So let's take a look through the list. The first one is Torah. Now, Torah and its root meaning is teaching. In modern Hebrew, the word morah means teacher. So Torah means teaching. It could also mean law. Sometimes in the Torah, it will say, this is the Torah of damages, or this is the Torah of lost property. So it could mean simply a specific teaching or a specific law. Most often in Jewish life, the word Torah refers to the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. In English, the titles are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They have different titles in Hebrew. But the idea was that the Torah was these first 5 books, and traditionally those were believed to have been given to Moses on a place called Mount Sinai, which we'll talk about in a couple of words. But in Jewish life, Torah also means, in the broader sense of teaching, but teaching related to those first 5 books. There's an idea in Rabbinic Judaism of an oral Torah, that there was a written Torah given to Moses, but also an oral Torah given to Moses and passed down that helps explain other laws or helps you interpret that written Torah. So Torah really is an expansive term. People will sometimes even say today, that was good Torah, or what interesting Torah you teach. Not that you're writing a new book like, 5b or book 6 to the 5-book Torah. Rather, the idea is that you're teaching in the spirit of that original source. So Torah has both a very limited meaning of those 5 books or even a particular law, or a very expansive meaning of any teaching related to the concept of those early books and their content. That's word number 1. Word number 2 is Tanakh. Tanakh is an acronym in Hebrew for Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, which means the first 5 books, as I mentioned. The Nevi'im are the prophets, and the Ketuvim are the writings. The Hebrew Bible is divided into 3 parts. Torah, the first 5 books, the prophets, which is another series of books that include both historical books and what we would consider prophetic books, just collections of sayings by prophets. And then the last section of books are the writings. Those include the books of Psalms and Proverbs, statements of wisdom, the book of Ecclesiastes, and the other festival scrolls. There are a series of 5 scrolls. The book of Job is there as well, asking deep questions about cosmic justice. The book of Chronicles is a retelling of the history that appears in the earlier books. And the book of Daniel is most likely the last book that made it into the Tanakh when the rabbis closed the canon. The earliest texts we have included in the Tanakh may be texts like the Song of Deborah, which may be as old as 1200 BCE. And the latest texts we have that made it into the Tanakh are most likely the book of Daniel, which was most likely written around the year 200, maybe 150 BCE. One of the reasons we know Daniel is late is a good chunk of Daniel is in Aramaic, which is a language the Jews didn't speak in an early period, but were speaking in the Persian and Hellenistic period later in Jewish history. So when someone says the Hebrew Bible, they don't mean the Torah. The Torah is part 1, but the Hebrew Bible is actually those 3 parts of Torah, prophets, and writings, or Tanakh. So if you want a Hebrew equivalent for a Hebrew Bible, it's Tanakh. The third word is the Exodus, or Sinai. If you've never heard of the Exodus, you can watch the 10 Commandments if you want to get a melodramatic version of it. Filtered through Cold War lenses, which is a really interesting way to watch the movie. Think about it that way. But the idea of the Exodus was that the Jews were slaves in Egypt, and they were delivered by a God who brought them to a special mountain on which he made a covenant, a special agreement with them. Again, that covenant is thought to have been encapsulated in the written Torah, but the idea of an Exodus experience or a Sinai moment as a defining point in Jewish theological history has been a building block of Jewish thought since the Torah was compiled and put together. They made the Exodus a core part of that narrative, and the covenant with the Hebrew God an important part of the national identity. Whether or not the Exodus or Sinai actually happened in history is a lot more dubious. There's not a lot of evidence that there was any kind of Exodus, certainly not in the numbers that are described in the Hebrew Bible. And I'll put it this way. If there actually had been a Sinai, then my entire professional life is a total lie. So I'm invested in the fact that there wasn't a Sinai. The fourth word is Talmud. I imagine a number of you have heard the word Talmud before, but may not know exactly what it is. So the Talmud is made up of 2 pieces. The first is an early collection of rabbinic sayings and legal decisions called the Mishnah. And often the Mishnah simply says, here is the law. There are 39 categories of work you're not allowed to perform on Shabbat. Harvesting and planting and reaping and threshing and writing 2 letters and erasing to write 2 letters and all kinds of categories of work. So the Mishnah is stating these laws outright. What the Talmud is further commentary on what the Mishnah has to say. Sherwin Weinstein has called it the footnotes, like the follow-up commentary to explain where they got this idea from, why 39 categories, why not more, and to further clarify what the law means. What counts as reaping? If I drop a knife and it happens to cut a stalk of wheat, is that intentional reaping and I'm violating the laws, or is that forgiven? And what about new circumstances where we have an automatic reaper that can do it by a robot? Does that count as doing the work if I started the robot before Shabbat started? I mean, you might think this is far-fetched, but in the Talmud, they debate the question about lighting a candle on Shabbat. Traditionally, you lit the candles before Shabbat started, but you could not light a new candle on Shabbat. So then someone asked, what if I have an oil lamp? I take a bag of oil and hang it over the lamp. And then I poke a hole in the bottom of the bag so a little bit of oil will drip onto that oil lamp over the course of Shabbat and allow the lamp to stay lit. Is that allowed? Or is that impermissibly causing things to kindle and to be lit? Well, the rabbis debate this, and the Talmud is where they debate it. They start with the straight out law in the Mishnah, and then they'll try to explain the context, maybe try to find a proof text in the Hebrew Bible that helps explain what the law is, or sometimes simply add on to the conversations. You'll get some rabbis say, if I had been there in that discussion 200 years ago, I would have said so-and-so. Or they ask, what was Rabbi so-and-so thinking when he said this? What did he mean? And so they try to expand it and explain it. But both the Mishnah, that early collection of sayings, and the Gemara, which is the completion, the second part that make up the Talmud together, Mishnah plus the Gemara commentary is the Talmud, all of those are focused on Jewish life in sort of two categories. One is understanding theology, legends, stories, and the other is what do I do? The law. How do I behave? And we'll talk a little bit more about Jewish law in a minute. Midrash is a word you may or may not have heard. Midrash is a way of understanding the biblical text. Drash means to spread out or to expand. So you would read a story and then maybe expand on the narrative. It says at the beginning of the binding of Isaac story, where Abraham is commanded to sacrifice his son, it says, after these things, God tested Abraham. What things? Well, Midrash will appear, or rabbis will do Midrash to fill in the gaps, to help explain what's going on in this story. Now, there's what's called Midrash Agadah, which is legendary Midrash focused on the stories, and then there's Midrash Halakha, which is trying to expand the laws to understand what you're supposed to do. That's that legend side versus the legal behavior side. I would bet everybody's heard the word kosher before. In English, we use it all the time, right? Something's kosher, it's allowed, permitted. The opposite of kosher is the next word, treif. Treif means forbidden, not allowed. So let me ask you, what would be some examples of things that are not kosher in the strict sense of dietary laws?
Mixing milk and meat.
So that's not kosher by rabbinic decision. It's not clear that's what the Hebrew Bible originally meant. That was a rabbinic innovation. But yes, mixing milk and meat is out. What are other examples?
Shellfish.
Shellfish, yeah.
Pork.
Pork.
Bot-
I'm sorry, Janet, what'd you say?
Bottom feeders.
Bottom feeders, right. Right. They want fish that are normal fish, fins and scales.
Mhm.
But, no shell things, no sharks with no scales, those are all weirdos.
Birds of prey.
Yes, no birds of prey. And in general, no predators. You don't eat things that eat blood. So you eat herbivores. You can have a cow, which is clearly an herbivore. There's all sorts of rules about what the hoofs have to look like and should it chew its cud or not, and how does it qualify. So that's the general concept of kosher laws. But of course, there's many, many more details. How is it slaughtered? Is it slaughtered the correct way? Is it examined for blood spots? Have you removed a certain tendon in a certain place? There's volumes and volumes to define kosher laws. And what counts as treif? Anything that's not kosher, right? It's what's forbidden.
Yeah. Rest
There's
of it.
there's actually a funny joke about a man who is getting his luggage examined at customs, and they find 5 sets of dentures in his suitcase, and they say, "Why do you have 5 sets of dentures?" And he said, "Well, I've got my dairy dentures and I've got my meat dentures." Okay, well, that's 2 of them. Well, but then I've got to have my kosher for Passover meat dentures and my kosher for Passover dairy dentures. Well, then what's the 5th one for? Oh, well, those are my treif dentures. So he's very concerned on the details of keeping everything separate for the milk and the meat, but he has a separate set of dentures just for the treif food. Okay. Now, the next word on the list is halakha. Halakha is the Hebrew word for Jewish law. It literally means like to walk. Halach is to walk. You might know in some other religious traditions, you have the path, which defines proper behavior. Taoism, the Tao is the path. Or in Arabic, in Islamic practice, Sharia is the path. It's the correct way to behave, and it is the law, the religiously based law. And I don't say religious law because we think of religious law as focused on how to pray or purity laws, but religious-based law means it's law for everything. It just comes from religious sources and is based on religious authority. So you would go to a rabbi to decide how much you owe your worker when they quit the job halfway through the day. You would go to a rabbi to decide when your ox got loose and it killed the ox of your neighbor, who's responsible and for how much. Damages, criminal cases, divorce law, and purity laws, how you plant your fields, what kind of sacrifices you offer, what time of day do you recite a prayer. All of it is included in the halakha. When rabbis are ordained, traditionally they would ask and answer 2 questions. Yoreh, can he teach? Yoreh, he can teach. Just like Torah, right? And the second question they would ask is, Yadin, can he judge? Yadin, he can judge. Because being a rabbi was deciding the halakha for people, was helping to give them rulings on what the law should be and how they should behave. When we ordain rabbis in Humanistic Judaism, by the way, we ask different questions. We do ask, Torah, can she teach? Torah, she can teach. And then, Taskil, can she enlighten? Taskil, she can enlighten. Because for us, enlightenment is more important than deciding Jewish law. Okay, the next one down is Adonai. Anyone have a guess what that is?
Isn't that Lord?
So Adon means Lord, Adonai means my Lord, or sometimes the Lord in all caps in a Hebrew Bible. What is it a stand-in for?
Elohim
Nope.
or Yahweh.
The real name of God.
The real name of God, right? God is the original he who shall not be named before Voldemort. You were not supposed to take the name in vain. You were not supposed to say it. It had special magic power. And so when you're reading a Torah text or a prayer in a traditional setting, you never say Yahweh or Yahweh or however it was pronounced. You say Adonai as the substitute. My Lord is the substitute for that Yud He Vav He name when it appears in a prayer book or in a blessing. So sometimes you hear it pronounced Adonai instead of Adonai. Adonai is the Sephardic pronunciation. Adonai is the Ashkenazi pronunciation, the Eastern European Jewish pronunciation. So it depends on when you learned your Hebrew and your blessings, how you might say it, or from where. And the last one is minhag. I'm curious, did anybody know what minhag is or had heard the word minhag before?
I heard it.
I
but
wasn't
don't
sure
remember.
if it was mincha, but I
No,
didn't
it's
know.
not mincha, which is a particular prayer service.
Right. No, that I didn't.
No. Minhag means custom or tradition. And there are certain parts of Jewish life that are simply minhag. They're customary, but they're not law. They're not halakha. So, for example, wearing a yarmulke is not prescribed in halakha. There's nothing in the Hebrew Bible or in the Torah, even more focused, that says anything about covering your head. It's a rabbinic innovation, but it's a rabbinic innovation based on the minhag, on the custom of doing so. So when you're looking at what Jews do in a historical context or in a traditional community, you sometimes have to ask, is this minhag or is this halakha? Is this just a custom or is it law? Now, some customs take on so much importance that you're not allowed to break them. You know, the minhag of covering your head is universal in the Orthodox world. You're not allowed to challenge it, even if you say, well, it's just a minhag. Too bad. The minhag has taken on the force of halakha, of law. And, you know, we've had that experience sometimes in American jurisprudence too, where, you know, some customs take on the force of law after time, or the idea of even a common law marriage is custom but not legal. Okay, so Yiddish, I imagine everybody knows, so I'll do a short answer. Yiddish is a Jewish language of Eastern European life, originally based on Middle German, written in Hebrew letters, and it's a combination of mostly German with a little bit of Slavic words and a few Latin-based words mixed in. So just to give you a couple examples, ich gehe, I go, is the Germanic style. A chochem, a sage, comes from the Hebrew word chacham. And to bench or to bless in Yiddish comes from the same root as benediction in Latin, which is a blessing or asking for something good. And sometimes you'll have two words for the same thing in Yiddish from different languages. So a buch is an ordinary book, but a sefer, which comes from the Hebrew, a sefer is an important book, a pious book, a religious book, a weighty, important book. So the plural would be bicher, books in the German style, or sforim, which is the plural of books in Hebrew, but with a Yiddish pronunciation for those important religious books. Okay, so Yiddish in 30 seconds. Now, the next word, apikoros, is one of my favorites. Apikoros is the Hebrew word for heretic, for a free thinker, someone who knows the law, who knows the beliefs, and simply refuses to believe them. It's different from an ignoramus, an am haaretz, who just doesn't know any better. The apikoros knows better, but is stubbornly rejecting those pieties that the authorities want him or her to follow. What I love about this is that this proves there were humanistic Jews a long time ago, because a word was created to refer to them, and it appears in the Mishnah. It appears, you know, we're talking 2,000 years ago, they were talking about the apikoros. Even better is the word they chose for heretic. If you learned any Greek philosophy, you might have heard of a philosopher named Epicurus. Epicurus had some radical things to say, like, if there are gods, why would they care about what happens to human beings? That would mean the gods' happiness is dependent on people, and then they're not perfect. So why would the gods care about us? So don't worry about the gods. And you're worried about what happens to you after you die. Do you go to Hades? Do you suffer? When you die, your body disperses into the atoms that made it up, and you simply are no more. There's nothing to worry about. So don't worry about what happens after you die. Enjoy life while you're here. Get yourself used to simple pleasures, because then you can always be happy, and, you know, eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. And there you go. Sounds good to me. So the fact that the rabbis not only had a word for heretic, but that they chose Epicurus, the philosopher, to base their epithet on, really is a testament to the fact that there's been Jewish skepticism for so many centuries. So sometimes it's good to claim the title of apikoros. I sometimes joke that we should call the Hadash choir the apikoros, but didn't take on. Okay,
like
the next one, oy vey. Does anyone not know what oy vey means? Oh no, woe is me. The full version is oy vey is mir in Yiddish, is, you know, woe to me. Okay. Sometimes you'll just hear vey is mir without the oy. Sometimes you just hear the oy.
Is it the same as Oi Gewalt?
Oy Gewalt's another one. Yep. Same idea.
But what's Gewalt?
Gewalt by itself, you know what? I don't remember. I just know it in the phrase.
Okay. Me too.
But yeah, but it's an old one for sure. And oy actually is an sort of an appeal that goes back to biblical Hebrew. I mean, you can find passages in the Bible where people say oy, because it's just alas, whoa, oh no.
Is
Uh,
Gavotte noise?
Gewalt noise? I don't know. I don't have my Yiddish dictionary on me, and I'm not in my office, so I can't look it up. If anybody wants to open up another window and go to Google Translate and go to Yiddish and type in Gewalt and see what you get, you'll be able to find it. Okay, the next one is chutzpah. Remember, chutzpah should have a ch at the beginning, but we don't have one letter for that in Hebrew, so I'm inconsistent in how I render that in this list. Chutzpah is nerve. Being crass, you might say balls, right? Gall. How dare you? You have chutzpah. This is the classic story of the man who kills both parents and then throws himself on the mercy of the court as an orphan. That's chutzpah. Shalom, familiar? Pretty much. Hello, goodbye, peace. And actually, I use it as a great example of how in Hebrew, words are built on three-letter roots. So the sh, sounds together have the meaning of peace, but also tranquility and completion, wholeness, to repay someone, to complete. Those are all connected concepts we might think. In English, we have lots of different words for them, but in Hebrew, you use those three-letter sounds to make words. Same thing for sefer is book, sifriya is library, sofer is a scribe, a beit sefer is a school. Unrelated words in English, but makes sense that they would be related in Hebrew. Bagel. Is it even Jewish anymore? Now that it's part of everyone's culture and available in the frozen food aisle, since Lenders did so in the 70s. One of the quirky things about bagels is the idea of boiled dough that you then bake is not uniquely Jewish. The idea of bread in a circle is not uniquely Jewish. It became uniquely Jewish when we left Eastern Europe and kept eating it. Same thing with lox. The word for salmon in Swedish and German is lox. It's just the word for salmon in those languages. But we keep eating it and we call it lox, even in English, with a special Jewish resonance for those who have those roots. So the bagel is an interesting example of non-Jewish cooking practice that becomes identified with Jews. By the way, it's the same thing with cabbage and corned beef for Irish people. That's something they picked up in America, and you only find it on St. Patrick's Day in Ireland in the tourist trap restaurants because they know the people are looking for it, even though it's not really traditional Irish food. Okay, the next word down is shtetl. Anyone know what shtetl means?
Shtetl was the little villages in Eastern Europe.
Close.
Segregate.
Shtetl literally means small town, not necessarily a village. You see, in Yiddish, a Stadt, or in German, a Stadt is a city.
True.
Shtetl is the diminutive ending, so it's a little city or a town. A dorf would have been a peasant village. So what we see in Fiddler on the Roof, where Tevi is living, is a dorf. That's a peasant village. But shtetls were actually small towns. Jews were surprisingly urbanized in Eastern Europe by the year 1900, certainly by 1930. Most of them had left the farms. And first of all, Jews weren't allowed to farm anyways. The serfs were the ones working on the farms, right? They were tied to the land. Jews lived in the cities where it was safer for them. And so they lived in small towns and cities. They were not farmers in the way that you imagine they might have been in the old country, which was the case for most of European peasantry, but the Jews were not European peasantry. They were something else, a different category. So the shtetl was actually a small town, not just a peasant village. Challah. Challah actually has two meanings. What meaning do you know of challah?
Braided bread.
Okay, the braided egg bread that's often eaten on Shabbat. But there's another meaning to challah, and you can get a clue for it if you look on a box of matzah for Passover, and you'll notice a little line written somewhere on the box that says, challah is taken. Now, what does challah have to do with matzah? Now, it doesn't mean they cleaned out all the challah for Passover. Challah literally means that you've taken a piece of the dough when you're baking any kind of bread, including matzah, and you've burned it up in the oven, reminiscent of the offerings that were given at the temple. A tenth of your flour was given as an offering whenever you were baking something. So the idea is you take a piece of the dough and you burn it up in the oven, even when you're making the challah, the braided loaf, but also even when you're making matzah, you take the challah out and burn that off. So that's why on a box of matzah, it says challah is taken. It's a little bit of offering that's given and made. Okay, next we're down, again, a couple of meanings to this one. Goy.
It's my wife, the shiksa.
Well, no, that's different. And you have to be careful with these words because shiksa actually is technically the term for a non-Jewish woman, but it comes from the same root as a creepy crawly insect.
Okay, I won't use it anymore.
And it has a promiscuous connotation to it. So you probably, I mean, as far as I know, you don't want to use that.
Yeah.
Goy also has connotations to it. Technically, goy means a non-Jewish person, often a man, but it has insulting connotations to it. So if you said that somebody had a goyish cup, means he has a non-Jewish head. It's another way of saying they're stupid. And if you had a Yiddish cup, a Jewish head, you were clever, you were smart, you were sharp. So again, it has an insult layer to it. But originally, the word goy had no insult whatsoever. It just meant a nation. In fact, at one point, when God is making a covenant with Abraham, he says, I will make of you a big goy. I will make of you a great nation. But the word for nation is goy. So Abraham is promised to be made into a big goy, which I laugh at, in my historical looking back sense. But literally, goy just means nation. So the goyim were the nations. That's everybody else. There's us and there's everybody else. That mentality still plays out in Israel today, by the way, because in modern Hebrew, you would refer to Israel as haaretz, the land, and the whole rest of the world, the other 99% of the globe, is chutz la'aretz, outside of the land. So there's us and there's everybody else. There's the Israelites, the Hebrews, the Jews, and the Goyim, the nations, the other 99.8% of the world's population. Okay, and the last one we have here is klezmer. Now, klezmer you might have heard of as a kind of music, maybe jazz inflected. It's based in Eastern Europe originally. A lot of the instruments that we hear in klezmer bands today are more recent additions. If you went back into the 1800s, you would have had klezmer bands with, maybe the oboe, definitely a violin, maybe a tambourine or some kind of percussive instrument. You wouldn't have had a saxophone, for example, or a big drum set with a hi-hat and all the other things you might think of in klezmer music today. And klezmer comes from two Hebrew words, clay, which means instruments, and zemer, which means melody. So the klezmer were the instruments of music, or the people who played the instruments of music, but with a particular style in Eastern Europe. The theory was that they found the instruments but didn't have classical training, so they just sort of played around with it. People often think of klezmer as the quintessential Jewish music, but if your family wasn't from Eastern Europe, you wouldn't have heard it because it's particular to Eastern European Jewish settings. Okay, we've gotten through 20 of the words in about 30 minutes. So that's good progress. But I wanted to ask if we were going kind of fast. I wanted to ask if there were any questions or comments or things that we sort of went through too quickly that you wanted to ask about or dive into a bit more.
I have a question on the challah.
Sure.
What is the significance of having that on the matzah if it's not like kosher for Passover matzah? Is it related to something in the Talmud, or that you
No, this is what I was saying
sacrifice
about
a piece of bread?
Yeah, the sacrificing of the piece of bread goes back to the Hebrew Bible and the Torah, where when you're harvesting your flour, you offer a bit of the flour as a sacrifice at the temple in Jerusalem. So every time you make a loaf of something, you take a challah off, you take a little piece off, and you burn that up, whether it's the braided bread or the matzah. So when the matzah says challah is taken, they don't mean the braided egg bread. And the matzah box, the challah is the piece of dough before it was baked that was taken off and burned up. So the word challah has two meanings there. It has the braided egg bread meaning, but it also has the little piece of dough that you burn up to make it kosher to eat the rest of the bread.
Oh, okay, so it makes it kosher, but not related to kosher for Passover.
Right, exactly. Because it's kosher for Passover based on how long the dough, the flour has been in the water and other kind of factors.
Okay, thank you.
Susie, please.
A question about Talmud. I've heard the terms Babylonian and Palestinian Talmud. Which one do they study these days, or what mediation be?
To some extent, both, but the Babylonian Talmud is more authoritative. Basically, there were two major centers of Jewish life until around the year 425 of the Common Era. There was the eastern center of Jewish life in what they called Babylon, but was really Baghdad as we think of it today, in Iraq, between the Mesopotamian, in Mesopotamia, between the rivers. The other major center was in the north of Israel, and that was where in the Galilee, which is where they created what's called the Palestinian Talmud, or in Hebrew it's called the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, even though they weren't in Jerusalem, but it's the land of Israel, the land of Jerusalem. Now, they were working on both sort of simultaneously, discussing. Sometimes people would travel back and forth between the two. There are stories about that. But around the year 425, you may recall the Roman Empire became Christian and then sort of backslid a bit and then really got serious about it. When the Roman Empire really got serious about becoming Christian, the Palestinian Talmud had to shut up shop. They couldn't continue their work. So the Palestinian Talmud, or the Jerusalem Talmud, has commentary on a certain number of parts of the Mishnah. The Babylonian Talmud is much more complete, covers a lot more of the Mishnah, is a lot longer. Sometimes they agree on their teachings. Occasionally they have variations of what they would teach, or they tell the same story a little bit differently. But they're both authoritative. It's just that one is more authoritative than the other one. So if people say they're studying Talmud, they generally are referring to the Babylonian Talmud. But in theory, they could refer to the Palestinian Talmud as another source. But, it'd be like, I don't know, like the Federalist Papers versus the Constitution. It's another source that explains the mindset of the people doing the work. But the Constitution is what's authoritative, and the Supreme Court decisions are what's authoritative, not the Federalist Papers, which tells you something about what's happening around the time that they're making the decision.
Thanks. Thank you.
Sure.